Welcome everyone to this anti-racism learning and development session. Whether you're a new staff member or just need a refresher, this video will serve as a foundation for understanding key concepts in our racial justice work. Today, we'll cover the cycle of socialization, the language of racial justice, liberatory consciousness, and the critical importance of self-awareness as we embark on this journey together. Our main goals today are to deepen authentic conversations about race and racism, explore the language of anti-racism and social identities, and practice self-awareness as a tool for effective change. These intentions will guide us as we move forward, fostering a shared understanding of how to navigate racial justice in the workplace and beyond. Now, let's discuss liberatory consciousness, a key concept from Dr. Barbara Love. Liberatory consciousness refers to the capacity to recognize and resist systems of oppression while living with awareness and intentionality. It involves four key components: awareness, analysis, action, and accountability. This model asks us to engage in critical self-reflection, identify our own social identities, and explore how power and privilege shape our experiences and interactions. By owning our power, we can challenge oppressive systems and create new possibilities for equity and justice. Self-awareness is a critical part of Dr. Barbara Love's liberatory consciousness framework. In her work, she emphasizes that self-awareness involves developing the capacity to notice, to give focused attention to our daily lives, our language, behaviors, and even our thoughts. This practice of self-awareness is essential because it allows us to recognize how we are shaped by and participate in systems of oppression. By being more mindful of our interactions and the impact of our choices, we can begin to challenge oppressive norms both within ourselves and in society. This heightened awareness is the first step toward liberation, as it helps us identify the power dynamics and biases that we've internalized, empowering us to take intentional action to interrupt those patterns. Through self-awareness, we create the space for transformative change, both personally and collectively. Now I will go into more detail about each aspect of the framework. 1. Awareness. Awareness is the foundation of liberatory consciousness. It starts with recognizing the world as it is. This means being critically aware of the social systems that shape our lives, systems like racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia. It's about understanding that these systems aren't just external forces. They deeply influence our personal experiences and relationships. Becoming aware requires self-reflection. We need to ask ourselves, how have I been socialized into these systems? How do they show up in my daily life and interactions? Awareness also involves acknowledging our own identities and social positions. It's essential to understand where we hold power and privilege and where we may be marginalized. This critical awareness is the first step toward liberation because it helps us see the ways oppression operates on both a personal and systemic level. 2. Analysis. Once we're aware, we move to analysis. This step involves understanding the root causes of oppression and injustice. It's not enough to simply recognize that inequality exists. We need to understand why and how these systems function. Analysis asks us to dig deeper into the structures that perpetuate oppression. For instance, racism is not just individual acts of bias, but is sustained by institutional policies, cultural norms, and historical legacies. By analyzing these systems, we can see the bigger picture, how oppression is maintained and what role we play in it. This step requires a critical examination of power dynamics both in society and in our own lives. We ask ourselves, how does power operate? Who benefits from the way things are, and who is harmed? This deeper analysis allows us to identify opportunities for intervention and change. 3. Accountability. Accountability in this framework is a critical part of the process, ensuring that our actions align with our values and goals for liberation. Accountability means staying committed to the work even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. It requires us to be open to feedback, to learn from our mistakes, and to keep growing. In practice, accountability might look like regularly checking in with ourselves and others about the impact of our actions. Are we truly challenging oppression, or are we inadvertently reinforcing it? Are we supporting those who are most affected by injustice, and are we listening to their voices? 4. Action. The final component is action. Awareness and analysis are crucial, but they must lead to action. In the liberatory consciousness framework, action means doing something to interrupt and challenge systems of oppression. It's about refusing to be passive in the face of injustice. Action can take many forms. It might mean speaking out against injustice when we see it, challenging our own biases and assumptions, or supporting policies and movements that promote equity. Action can be small and personal, like intervening when a friend makes a harmful comment, or it can be large scale, like organizing for systemic change. Dr. Love emphasizes that liberatory action is not just about resisting oppression, but also about creating new possibilities. It's about imagining and building a world where justice, equity, and liberation are the norm. This means thinking creatively about how to dismantle harmful systems and replace them with more equitable ones. Now, we are going to spend a little bit of time engaging some key terms that are essential for understanding racial justice and dismantling systems of oppression. These terms will help us build a shared language, which is crucial in fostering meaningful conversations. These terms are foundational and ever evolving, so see these as both an entry point to the conversation as well as one way of thinking about these ever evolving terms and their corresponding concepts. Race is not a biological reality, rather, it is a social construction. This means race was created by society as a way to interpret human differences. However, it's not just about categorizing people, it's about justifying socioeconomic arrangements that benefit the dominant group. In many cases, these arrangements historically and presently benefit white people at the expense of people of color. This leads us to racism. Racism is the use of institutional or structural power to reinforce racial stereotypes or prejudice. It's more than just individual bias. Racism happens when people in power use their positions to create, maintain, and enforce policies and practices that promote racial inequity. This kind of power perpetuates systems that disadvantage marginalized racial groups and keep them at a lower status in society. Structural oppression refers to the complex ways history, public policies, institutional practices, and even cultural representations interact to maintain a racial hierarchy. Over time, these systems have worked together to produce inequitable racial group outcomes. Examples include discriminatory housing policies, unequal access to education, and the disproportionate incarceration of people of color. At the heart of this system is white supremacy. White supremacy is the belief that white people's thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and actions are superior to those of people of color. This ideology is deeply embedded in all our institutions and practices and shapes how society operates, from legal systems to media portrayals. It perpetuates a false hierarchy that elevates white people while devaluing the lives, contributions, and perspectives of people of color. Next, we need to discuss power. Power is the ability to produce a response. It can manifest in many ways, including the ability to name or define things, the ability to set rules and standards, and even the ability to change the rules when necessary. Prejudice is another important term to understand. Prejudice refers to preconceived opinions, attitudes, or beliefs about individuals or groups that aren't based on reason or actual experience. These attitudes can be harmful because they lead to assumptions and stereotypes that further reinforce systems of inequality and oppression. Finally, we have bias. Bias can be either conscious or unconscious, meaning we might be aware of it or not. Bias refers to a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone. It's crucial to recognize bias because it can influence decisions, behaviors, and policies in ways that maintain inequality, even when we don't intend it to. Let's take a closer look at the 4 levels of racism as defined by Dr. Jones. The first level is internalized racism. This refers to the deeply ingrained beliefs, prejudices, and ideas that individuals hold about the superiority of white people and the inferiority of people of color. These beliefs can exist within people of any race. For people of color, internalized racism can manifest as self-doubt, low self-esteem, or even hatred for their own racial group. It's the internalization of the societal messages that claim one race is superior and others are inferior. This form of racism is especially harmful because it leads to individuals participating in their own oppression without even realizing it. The second level is interpersonal racism. This is racism that occurs in interactions between individuals. It happens when a person's private beliefs about race affect how they treat others. Interpersonal racism can be overt, such as racial slurs or discriminatory actions, or it can be more subtle, like making assumptions about someone's intelligence or abilities based on their race. These individual level interactions may seem isolated, but they are informed by the larger societal messages about race and racial superiority. Interpersonal racism perpetuates harmful stereotypes and reinforces societal divisions based on race. Next, we have institutional racism. Institutional racism refers to the policies, practices, and procedures within organizations or institutions that result in unequal treatment or outcomes based on race. This type of racism is often embedded in the everyday functioning of schools, workplaces, healthcare systems, and the criminal justice system. For example, discriminatory hiring practices that favor white candidates over equally qualified candidates of color are examples of institutional racism. It's often more difficult to spot because it's normalized in the functioning of organizations. However, its impact is profound as it systematically disadvantages people of color and reinforces racial inequities within society. Finally, we reach the fourth level, structural racism. Structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, and cultural norms interact in complex, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequality across society. This form of racism is the most pervasive and hardest to dismantle because it is built into the fabric of our institutions and culture. An example of structural racism would be the racial wealth gap in the United States, which has been created and reinforced by historical practices such as redlining, unequal education opportunities, and biased criminal justice policies. Structural racism operates on a societal level and influences outcomes in housing, employment, education, and health. Dr. Jones uses the powerful metaphor of the gardener's tale to illustrate these levels of racism. In this story, a gardener has two flower boxes, one with rich soil and the other with poor, rocky soil. She plants seeds from two different types of flowers in the respective boxes. Over time, the flowers in the rich soil thrive, while those in the poor soil struggle to grow. The gardener, seeing this, concludes that the flowers in the rich soil are inherently better without considering the impact of the soil. The gardener represents those with power in society, and the soil represents the environment shaped by racism. The thriving flowers reflect the privileged group, while the struggling flowers represent marginalized groups. The tale emphasizes how the conditions set by structural, institutional, and interpersonal racism disadvantage some while privileging others. I hope the through lines between self-awareness, definitions, and the gardener's tale are making sense to you. The next important and critical foundational framework to understand is our social identity. We're going to take a quick look at the social identity wheel, a tool that helps us reflect on how our various social identities shape our experiences and interactions in the world. Just for a point of clarity, social identities refer to the various categories we each belong to based on characteristics like race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, age, and religion. These are the individual aspects of who we are that shape our experiences and how we interact with the world. On the other hand, social group identities refer to the broader groups or communities that share similar characteristics or experiences within those social categories. For example, someone's social identity might be that they are Black, while their social group identity is tied to their membership in the Black community, which shares a collective experience of racial identity, culture, and often shared experiences of oppression or privilege. In essence, social identities are individual, while social group identities relate to the larger collective experience within those categories. The social identity wheel is a tool that encourages us to consider the different parts of our identity that are both visible and invisible. These aspects include race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, religion, age, and more. Each of these categories represents social identities that can impact how we move through the world and how we are treated by others. For example, let's think about race. Your racial identity can have a significant influence on your experiences depending on societal perceptions and systems in place. For people of color, racial identity often comes with experiences of marginalization or discrimination, while for white people, racial identity can come with unearned privilege. Reflecting on this helps us understand the impact of societal structures on our daily lives. Another important aspect to consider is gender. Gender identity shapes expectations and norms around how we should behave, what roles we should take on, and even the opportunities we have. Women, men, and non binary people may experience different levels of privilege or oppression depending on how their gender is viewed and valued in society. The social identity wheel encourages us to ask questions like, which identities do I think about the most? Which identities do I think about the least? How do my identities shape the way I see the world and the way the world sees me? What identities do we want to learn more about? Now, some of these identities might be dominant and others might be subordinated. Dominant identities are those associated with more social power, privilege, or status, like being male, able-bodied, or heterosexual. Subordinated identities, on the other hand, often come with less access to power or opportunities, like being a woman, a person of color, or LGBTQ+. For example, someone might reflect that they think about their class identity a lot because it affects how they can participate in certain spaces. On the other hand, they may not think about their religious identity often because it's aligned with the dominant culture, like being Christian in the United States. One of the most valuable aspects of the social identity wheel is its ability to help us become more self-aware. By reflecting on our own identities, we can start to see how our experiences of privilege or marginalization are not random, they are tied to larger societal patterns. This self-awareness is key to understanding how we navigate systems of power and how we can be more intentional in addressing inequality. For instance, think about sexual orientation. If someone identifies as heterosexual, they might not think about how societal norms and structures cater to their identity, making it easier to navigate the world. Meanwhile, a person who identifies as LGBTQ+ may think about their sexual orientation often because of the potential for discrimination or exclusion in various spaces. The social identity wheel invites us to reflect on how different aspects of who we are influence these everyday experiences. In addition, the social identity wheel encourages us to think about intersectionality. This means considering how our various identities like race, gender, and class intersect and create unique experiences. For example, being a woman of color presents different challenges than being a white woman or a man of color. Understanding intersectionality helps us recognize that we all have multiple layered identities that shape how we experience the world. Using the social identity wheel, we can also consider which identities have the strongest effect on how we see ourselves. Sometimes the parts of our identity that we think about most often are not the same as the ones that have the strongest impact on our self-concept or our sense of belonging in different spaces. This reflection helps us understand ourselves better and gives us insight into how we can contribute to social change. Next, we're going to explore the matrix of oppression, a framework that helps us understand the complex ways that social identities intersect with systems of privilege and oppression. This tool is invaluable for seeing how different forms of oppression like racism, sexism, and classism operate in society and affect individuals depending on their social identities. Let's break it down. The matrix of oppression maps out social identities along with the privileged and marginalized groups for each identity category. The key social identities we'll focus on include ability, age, appearance, race, ethnicity, immigration status, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and class. 1. Ability. Let's start with ability. People who are temporarily able-bodied or able-minded hold privilege in society. This means that many public spaces, institutions, and societal norms are designed with their needs in mind. On the other hand, people with physical, mental, emotional, or learning disabilities face ableism. They are part of targeted social groups that experience barriers to access, discrimination, and societal exclusion. These individuals often face a world that is not designed for them, resulting in significant challenges in education, employment, and daily life. 2. Age. Next, we have age. In our society, adults between the ages of 30 and 65 are often considered to be in their prime, giving them more social and economic privilege. Ageism affects both younger and older people. Those under 30, especially between 18 and 29, may be in a border social group and often face stereotypes of being inexperienced or immature. Meanwhile, elderly individuals often face discrimination, lack of respect, and exclusion from opportunities because of the assumption that they are less capable or valuable to society. 3. Appearance. Appearance also plays a major role in social privilege. People with toned, lean, Eurocentric features enjoy what is known as appearance privilege. They are considered to fit societal standards of beauty. However, individuals who do not meet these standards, whether due to body size, weight, or features not considered ideal face lookism or sizeism. These people are judged and marginalized based on their appearance, facing discrimination in both personal and professional settings. 4. Race and ethnicity. Let's turn to race and ethnicity. In the United States, white people are often considered part of the privileged group in terms of race, and Anglo-Saxon, Western Europeans dominate in terms of ethnicity. People of color, Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, and other non-white racial groups fall into the targeted groups for racism. Ethnic minorities, such as Eastern Europeans or immigrant groups that don't fit the Anglo norm, also face ethnocentrism, where one's ethnic identity becomes a point of marginalization. 5. Immigration status. Immigration status further complicates this matrix. American citizens hold a privileged position, while undocumented immigrants or legal immigrants often face xenophobia, the fear or hatred of foreigners. This group faces systemic barriers, from limited access to public services to discriminatory laws and social exclusion. 6. Religion. In the United States, Christianity is the dominant religion, giving mainstream Christians privilege in terms of social and cultural norms. Those who are non-Christian, including Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, or atheists, often face religion-based oppression. This can manifest in workplace discrimination, lack of religious accommodations, or negative stereotypes that lead to social isolation and exclusion. 7. Gender and gender identity. Gender is another important category. Cisgender men who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth are often in a privileged position, while transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming individuals face sexism and gender identity-based oppression. They experience discrimination in healthcare, employment, and even legal recognition of their identities. 8. Sexual orientation. Next, we have sexual orientation. Heterosexual individuals, or those who are attracted to people of the opposite gender, enjoy privilege in a society structured around heterosexual norms. Homosexual, bisexual, and asexual people, however, experience heterosexism. They often face exclusion, discrimination, or violence because of their sexual orientation, making it harder for them to live openly and authentically. 9. Class. Finally, we come to class. Rich and upper class individuals hold significant privilege, including access to wealth, education, and social connections that enable them to maintain their status. People in working or lower classes face classism, where they experience economic disadvantages, limited opportunities, and social stigma. Class oppression often intersects with other forms of marginalization, compounding challenges for individuals from multiple oppressed groups. The matrix of oppression helps us see that oppression is not just about individual actions or attitudes, but about the systemic and structural forces that advantage certain social groups while disadvantaging others. These systems of oppression are interconnected, meaning a person can experience privilege in one area and oppression in another. For example, someone might be privileged by their race, but oppressed by their class or gender identity. This framework invites us to critically reflect on our own social identities and how we may benefit from or be harmed by these systems. By understanding the matrix of oppression, we can begin to identify where inequities exist and take steps toward dismantling the structures that maintain them. Finally, we're going to explore a fundamental concept that shapes how we understand our identities and the world around us, the cycle of socialization. This framework helps us see how we are conditioned into societal norms, including the systems of power and oppression that affect our daily lives. Let's break this down. The cycle starts before we're even born. We're each born into a set of social identities, such as gender, race, class, and more. These identities are ascribed to us based on the context in which we're born, and we have no control over them. For example, no one asks us in the womb if we want to be male or female, wealthy or poor, black or white. These identities shape our experiences and interactions from the moment we enter the world. From birth, we begin to be socialized by the people closest to us, our families and caregivers. These people whom we trust and love teach us how to behave, what's acceptable and what's not. Whether they realize it or not, they pass down messages about how to navigate our social identities. For instance, we might be told things like boys don't cry or don't trust people who are different from you. These early lessons shape our sense of self and the expectations we have for others. And it's important to remember these messages aren't necessarily passed on with ill intent. Our caregivers are often passing down what they've learned, continuing the cycle. As we grow older, other institutions take on a significant role in shaping our understanding of the world. These include schools, places of worship, the media, workplaces, and even healthcare systems. Each of these institutions reinforces societal norms and values, often without us realizing it. For example, in school, we might learn that certain subjects are for boys and others for girls. We may observe that students of color are disciplined more harshly than white students. These observations reinforce power dynamics and stereotypes that we've already begun to absorb at home. But the cycle doesn't stop there. Society has built in mechanisms that enforce these roles and expectations. If we step out of the norms we've been taught, there are often consequences. For example, men who show emotion may be labeled as weak, or women who assert themselves in the workplace may be considered aggressive. On the flip side, those who conform to the roles prescribed by society are often rewarded. These rewards can be as simple as acceptance or as significant as gaining more opportunities and power. These rewards and punishments create results that affect everyone in society, whether we realize it or not. For people in marginalized groups, this cycle can lead to internalized oppression, believing the negative messages society imposes on them, which can cause low self-esteem, stress, or even self-destructive behavior. For people in privileged groups, it can result in ignorance or a sense of superiority, reinforcing the system of oppression. Both outcomes are harmful, both to individuals and to society as a whole. So, what do we do about it? The good news is that the cycle can be interrupted. It starts with awareness by reflecting on the social identities we hold and recognizing how they shape our lives. Once we begin to see how we've been socialized, we can start to challenge these roles. That means questioning the messages we've been taught, both about ourselves and others. It means becoming more aware of our biases and how they show up in our interactions. But awareness alone isn't enough. The next step is taking action. We have the power to disrupt the cycle of socialization by actively working against the norms that perpetuate inequality. This might mean speaking up when we witness discrimination or reflecting on how our own behaviors reinforce harmful systems. It also means being willing to engage in difficult conversations and build coalitions with people across different identities. Together, we can begin to create a new cycle, one that is based on equity, inclusion, and justice for all. So, to recap, the cycle of socialization starts before we're born and is reinforced throughout our lives by the people we trust and the institutions we encounter. It's a self-perpetuating system that shapes how we see ourselves and others, but with awareness and intentional action, we can break the cycle and work toward creating a more just society. Thank you for staying with me through this deep exploration of social identities, systems of oppression, and the matrix of oppression. Let's take a few moments to tie all these ideas together and reflect on what we've learned. We began by discussing the concept of social identity. Each of us carries multiple social identities: our race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, and more. These identities shape our lived experiences and how society perceives and treats us. Some identities grant us privilege, offering unearned advantages, while others place us in targeted groups that experience marginalization and discrimination. At the core of this conversation is the matrix of oppression, a framework that helps us understand how different forms of oppression such as racism, sexism, classism, and ableism operate in society. This matrix is an interconnected system that disadvantages certain groups while elevating others. The complexity of the matrix reveals that no single form of oppression exists in isolation. A person might experience privilege in one area of their life, but oppression in another. For example, a white woman may experience racial privilege, but still encounter sexism. Understanding these intersections helps us see how oppression works on multiple levels. A crucial point that we discussed is the distinction between individual bias and systemic oppression. While individual acts of discrimination are harmful, the deeper issue lies within the systems and institutions that perpetuate inequality. Institutional racism, for example, isn't just about personal prejudice. It's about policies and practices that have historically favored white people over people of color in areas like housing, education, and employment. These systems of power are self-perpetuating and continue to affect marginalized groups even if no individual intends harm. This is where the concept of intersectionality becomes so important. Intersectionality, as coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, reminds us that people's identities are not one-dimensional. A Black woman, for instance, may face discrimination not just because of her race or her gender, but because of how those identities intersect in a society that devalues both. The matrix of oppression helps us see these intersections clearly, providing a framework to understand how various forms of oppression combine to shape people's experiences in complex ways. We also examine the importance of self-awareness in this work. In Dr. Barbara Love's model of liberatory consciousness, self-awareness is the first step toward liberation. By reflecting on our own social identities and how we've been socialized, we can begin to understand how we either benefit from or are harmed by these systems of oppression. Self-awareness allows us to notice how our actions, language, and behaviors reinforce these systems even unintentionally, and gives us the power to make conscious changes in our lives and communities. From this place of awareness, we can move toward action. Once we understand how these systems work, we have a responsibility to interrupt them. This might mean advocating for policy changes that dismantle institutional racism or challenging biased comments when we hear them in everyday life. Change starts at both the individual and institutional levels. It's not enough to be aware of the problem. We must also be willing to act on that awareness. Another key point is accountability. As we reflect on our own identities and take steps toward challenging systems of oppression, we must also hold ourselves accountable to the people and communities we seek to support. This means listening to marginalized voices, learning from them, and ensuring that our actions align with the principles of equity and justice. So, where do we go from here? The matrix of oppression and the conversations we've had today are meant to give us tools for understanding the world we live in. But more than that, they are meant to empower us to be part of the solution. Each of us has the power to make a difference in the spaces we occupy, whether that's in our workplaces, our communities, or even within our families and friendships. It starts with acknowledging the privilege we hold and the oppression we may face. From there, we can begin the work of dismantling these systems. In conclusion, I encourage you to continue reflecting on your own social identities and the ways in which you are connected to systems of privilege and oppression. Consider how you can use the power and privilege you hold to support marginalized groups and challenge unjust systems. Remember, this work is ongoing, and it requires each of us to stay engaged, open to learning, and committed to creating a more equitable and just world for everyone. Thank you for being part of this journey today. Let's continue working toward liberation together.